Chapter 10. Let's talk a little more about international monetary system and more specifically about exchange rates. Let me run a quick quiz just to see how much you know about exchange rates. If you miss some of these questions, don't worry. About 95% of my students get these questions wrong. The kind of funny part about this exercise is that not only about 95% of the students get these questions wrong, the funny part is that it's almost a shame, not almost, it is shame not to be able to answer these questions in your third or fourth year in the business program. But anyway, let's see, maybe you are smarter than them. Maybe you can get these questions better, answer these questions correctly. Question 1. The British pound is more expensive than the US dollar. Roughly 1 British pound is worth roughly 1.59 American dollars. The questions are: 1. Which currency is currently stronger? Just write down A if you believe that the UK pound is stronger, and put B if you believe that the American dollar is stronger. Question number 2. Which country has a higher cost of living? Put A if you believe that the UK has a higher cost of living, and write down B if you believe that the United States has a higher cost of living. Question 3. Which economy is doing better? Again, based on the information provided, if you believe that the United Kingdom is doing better economically, put A. If you believe that the United States is doing better economically, put B. Right? Now again, I don't know what you gave there as an answer. I'm just telling that roughly 95% get it completely wrong. Let me do it one more time, and let's see if you maybe have some doubts and maybe you want to change your answer. 1 Kuwaiti dinar is worth about 3.54 American dollars. In other words, a Kuwaiti dinar is more than 3 times as expensive as an American dollar. Based on this information, which currency is currently stronger, the Kuwaiti dinar or the US dollar? Again, based on this information, question 2, which country has a higher cost of living? And finally, which economy is doing better, Kuwait's or that of the United States? Now, I don't know what you put there. I'll just tell you what most students put there. Most students say that based on the information provided, the United Kingdom and Kuwait do better economically, have a higher cost of living, and their currency is currently stronger. This is a completely wrong answer. By the way, if you gave me the answer the other way around, this is also shame on you. This is a very wrong answer. The correct answer is that none of these questions can be answered on the information provided. Absolutely none. There is no way you can tell which currency is stronger based on the information on the exchange rate. There is no way you can tell which country has a higher cost of living. There is absolutely no way to tell which economy is doing better. So when we look at the graph, for example, here, so this is the British pound to the US dollar. If anything, the British pound is actually losing its value compared to the US dollar. And so if anything, British pound is a weaker currency than the US dollar is, because there was a time when it was exchanging at 2-to-1 rate. And just a few months later, actually a few years later, is actually now roughly 1.5, 1.6 to 1. So if anything, the UK pound is weaker and it's losing its value compared to the US dollar. And the only way we can tell which one is stronger, whatever that means, is to look at the dynamics. A specific exchange rate at a specific day tells us nothing. Unless we know where it was yesterday, we can tell if it's comparatively stronger or weaker compared to where it was before. But just the exchange rate doesn't tell us anything. For example, Japanese yen is about 80 times cheaper than the American dollar. Does it mean that Japan has a weaker currency? Absolutely not. We just cannot tell based on this information. The same applies to the cost of living. So what? I mean, just because the exchange rate is different, we have nothing, we don't know anything about cost of living. In the UK or in Kuwait, the currency is more expensive in terms of the price, but it doesn't tell us how much things cost there. So just because, for example, the Japanese yen is about what, like 15 cents, not 15, 1.5 cents of the US dollar, it doesn't tell us that Japan has everything that is 80 times cheaper. It's just a different exchange rate. And most certainly it doesn't tell us anything about the state of the economy. The exchange rates are absolutely useless in predicting the state of economy. Maybe if you look at the dynamics over time, you can infer something about the state of the economy. But just one-time spot rate, it just doesn't tell you anything. When we look also at the Kuwaiti dinar, it's exactly the same story. So if anything, the Kuwaiti dinar today is cheaper than where it was a few years ago. So we can, looking at the dynamics, we can actually say that the US dollar is much stronger because it's gaining value against the Kuwaiti dinar. But it's definitely not telling us anything when we just look at that exchange rate, and we can't really say anything based on that one specific number or two numbers. Now again, another thing I would like to discuss is some terminology problems. The reason I'm almost mad at the terms that have been used in currency exchange topic or area is very misleading. We talk about what we call strong and weak currencies. And these terms are not only wrong, they're actually very misleading. Psychologically or emotionally, we like the term strong. Everybody wants to be strong, everybody wants to be associated with strong, and nobody likes weak or wants to be associated with weak. So when we say strong, it kind of feels good, and we want to have strong currency. And at the same time, when we say weak, nobody likes weak. We don't want to have weak currency. The reality is, though, that these terms are completely inapplicable when we talk about currency market. We shouldn't be calling any currency strong or weak. Those are bad, and not only bad, those are misleading terms. When we say strong, what we really should be saying is overpriced, right? So strong is overpriced or more expensive. But overpriced or more expensive or one that is gaining value is not necessarily strong. We're never saying that, for example, this cell phone is strong or weak because its price is high or low. Strong or weak is just basically those terms. All they tell us is that how the price of that product is changing. But again, increasing price doesn't necessarily mean something good, whereas strong does mean something good, and so that's where people get confused. So strong and weak, really what those terms mean is that the currency is either overpriced or underpriced, or gaining value or losing value. The same thing when the better terms, much better terms would be overpriced, underpriced, or even better terms would be stable or volatile. What we call a weak currency is a currency whose value fluctuates a lot. And a strong currency is the one that has a very stable exchange rate. But again, when you think about it from the perspective of stable versus volatile, you obviously understand that it has nothing to do with strength or weakness. So these terms would be much more informative. Stable, volatile. So what I would like you to do from now on, when you talk about currencies, don't use the terms strong and weak. Talk about overpriced or underpriced if you're referring to the price at a given point, or talk about stable or volatile when you talk about the price dynamics, or maybe a rising in value or losing value. So those terms will really mean what you mean. And so when we talk about a currency as strong and weak, we don't want it to be weak. It just sounds bad. But the problem is, and as we will discuss later, weak currency is actually good. But by weak, what we really mean is underpriced, and sometimes we want our currency to be underpriced, or to be stable or volatile. And so again, those are very different things from just strong and weak. So just keep that in mind, because again, every time you say strong and weak, you get yourself into that trap of emotional thinking, and rather than thinking here, you start thinking here, and you may make a wrong economic decision. Keep that in mind. Now, let me give you another test just to make sure that you know what predicts currency exchange rates. Tell me if it's true or false. Currency exchange rate fluctuations are primarily affected by different levels of inflation in different countries. So, currency exchange rates fluctuations, the reasons why currency exchange rates change is because inflation level in different countries is different, and that causes the exchange rates change over time. If it's true, write down A. If it's not true, if it's false, write down B. I'll give you the answer in a second. Another question. The price of one Big Mac is $3 in the United States and is 9 yuans in China. Where does one Big Mac cost more? So it's $3 in the United States, 9 Chinese yuans in China. Where does it cost more? In question 3, why do same products have different prices in different countries? And by prices, I don't only mean the number but the actual real price when you take into account the exchange rate. So why do you have different prices in different countries? We're going to talk about this in a few seconds, but let me first give you the answers. So first, currency exchange rates fluctuations, inflation has pretty much nothing to do with it. Sometimes when a country has a huge inflation, like 2000% a year, obviously at that stage, the currency exchange rate of that country will be sliding down all the time. But if you look at the exchange rates of, for example, Canadian dollars versus American dollar, or the British pound versus the US dollar, you will see that the rates have been changing a lot. And in fact, I just showed you a couple of graphs. So like, for example, British pound to the US pound, we have seen a roughly 60% change in the exchange rate of this currency. At the same time, you understand that inflation in the two countries has been pretty much the same all last century. In the United States and in the UK, the inflation has been what, about 2-3% a year, year in and year out. So obviously inflation has absolutely nothing to do, at least when we compare currencies of the major countries. Again, when, for example, Ukraine in 1993-94 had 10,000% inflation a year, yes, inflation could have been a factor there. But at this time, just about any country that is, doing economically reasonably well, where inflation stays between 1 and 5%, obviously exchange rates fluctuate much more than that. And so obviously inflation is pretty much irrelevant in this context. Going back to the questions about the price of the Big Mac, again, the correct answer is we cannot answer this question based on the information provided. Unless we know the exchange rate of the US dollar to the Chinese yuan, we wouldn't be able to explain or predict or tell where Big Mac cost more, because 9 or 3, those are just numbers, and they don't mean anything unless we know how those numbers correspond to one another, unless we know the exchange rate. In Japan, for example, a Big Mac costs roughly 200 yuan. Does it mean that it's 200 times cheaper? Obviously not. The only way we can tell what the price is if we know the exchange rate, and once we do, we then can do some conversions, right? Now, why do some products have different prices through cost in different countries? Well, we'll have a separate slide for that, but I'll give you a hint. Labor cost may be different, cost of living may be different, cost of components or natural resources or materials may be different, so all those factors may affect the price of products. And so for that reason, for example, a hot dog in Manhattan may cost more than a same hot dog would cost here on campus in Yum Yum. Is it possible to predict exchange rates? Well, that's what we'll discuss today in today's class. And then if you wanted to predict exchange rates, what would you take into account? Many people say that they would take into account the state of the economy, and that's not a very good answer. Yes, the economy may be relevant, but only in a very distant way. Again, when you look at the exchange rates in different countries, you would see that they change a lot. But then economies of these countries have not been really doing that differently overall. Like the United States, Canada, pretty much every European country, all experienced more or less the same type of crisis in the last 3 years. All have been doing more or less equally economically. At the same time, the exchange rates for these countries have changed dramatically. Like many, many times. And so, obviously, again, if it was all about the economy, then the economies have been really growing fast in one country and going down big time in another country to cause that kind of difference in exchange rates. So while the economy overall may be relevant, it's definitely not the main factor, and we'll talk about that. Plus, again, if you think about it, exchange rates sometimes change up to 10% within a day. Well, obviously, economies are not changing, or state of the economy. The state of the economy is not changing that fast. Definitely not over one day. And it's also very unlikely that some new information would be available about the state of the economy that would affect exchange rates so much. So there must be other factors at play, and we'll discuss them in a few minutes. So why are we talking about it in the first place? Well, let me give you some historic perspective. As you know, the different countries have different currencies. And since the ancient times, it was very difficult to exchange goods using different standards of measurement. If we all had the same currency, it would be easier. For $1, I can exchange or buy this product there and then resell it for, let's say, $1 or $2 here. That would give us some form of a standard exchange equivalent. But because we're all settled on different exchange equivalents, different currencies, international trade becomes a problem. And so people have been, since ancient times, have been trying to invent those standard exchange equivalents or exchange standards. And so before the 1700s, that standard was primarily gold. And before that, people used all kinds of stuff, from coffee beans to seashells to all kinds of other things. But again, for a long time, it was gold. Gold was very conveniently limited in supply. It wouldn't rust or it wouldn't rot, and so it would last forever. And so there was some form of a standard exchange equivalent. But then, unfortunately, gold had a number of problems. First, it's heavy, and so if you need to buy a lot of stuff in a different country, you would literally have to carry several tons of gold, and it's not always easy. Second, it is easy to lose. I mean, let's say you have a whole, some form property or lots of wealth, and you want to move it to a different country. So you would need to sell it for gold, bring your gold with you, and buy then an equivalent amount of property in another country. But then again, along the way, you can lose your gold. Somebody can steal it, or somebody, something else can happen. And so that makes gold not a perfect exchange equivalent. And then obviously when you carry your gold, for example, on water in a boat, if the boat sinks, your gold, you basically lose all your wealth. So that makes it very inconvenient. Then gold still was playing a major role, and so for about 300-400 years since the 1700s, there was a gold standard. So it was not really your gold, meaning that you wouldn't really carry a bag of gold every time you want to buy something. Rather, there was a gold standard. So we knew how much one currency is worth in gold and how much another currency is worth in gold. And so the banks, the central banks or the kings or the monarchs, they would actually have the gold that would represent the money that is currently in circulation in their country. So every time it would take either a dollar or whatever currency your country has, we knew how much gold each of those pieces of paper represents. And we knew that at any given time we could bring that piece of paper and exchange it for that fixed amount of gold. So we had that gold standard. It was a little bit more convenient because, once you have the gold in a secure vault somewhere, you wouldn't have to carry it around all the time. So you just carry the pieces of paper that represent that gold. And again, sometimes it would be like big pieces of paper that would actually write how much gold you have. And then eventually we had the bank notes that again were tied to the gold exchange. And so that was a little bit more convenient to use. But then again, the gold standard had a number of disadvantages. One, if every piece of paper that you use must represent a specific amount of gold, you wouldn't be able to really print new pieces of paper, new money, unless you discovered or bought new reserves of gold. And so while that was actually a good thing because it led to more stable exchange rates as well as prevented inflation, the problem is that sometimes you as a government, you might want to print some money. You might want to influx money into the economy to stimulate growth. And so when we moved beyond that prehistoric mercantilism stage, we realized that we could actually do a lot of good by sometimes stimulating the economy and maybe even printing money or maybe having a healthy level of inflation. And so with the gold standard, once we agreed that $1, for example, represents 1 ounce of gold, that was impossible to do, right? And so that was impossible under the gold standard policies to issue loans and stimulate economy. Second, and this is very important, the economy is constantly growing, right? So every year we tend to make more than we did a year before. Better technologies come along, more people are born, and so more work is done. We learn how to make things better, productivity grows, and ideally we want the amount of money grow along with the economy. So that, for example, one cell phone costs $100 today, and it will cost also $100 tomorrow, even though we will be making 10 of these cell phones for every one we made last year. So ideally we want the money to represent the things that you can buy with that money. And so again, with the gold standard, it was not always possible to keep increasing the gold reserves at the pace at which the economy was growing, which made it very difficult to, again, keep the money's value more or less stable compared to the state of the economy. So in a sense, the cost of money was increasing very much over time. And so as the economy was growing, we would see the appreciation of the money or of the gold that the money represented. And so there was no incentive really to spend the money because, I mean, by simply keeping the money, the gold in your pockets or pieces of paper that represent the gold, you were getting wealthier. And again, that's not what we want. We want people to use the excess wealth that they have and invest it into the economy. And with the gold standard, that was very difficult to do. And so eventually, over time, particularly in the last 50 years or so, most of the countries of this planet converted to fluid, flexible exchange rates. So the exchange rates may be set by the central bank, or just the market determines how much each currency is worth. And so that gives many more options to the government in terms of how they can affect the economy. But at the same time, obviously, it also makes it less stable in terms of the exchange rates. So more money is printed in one country, exchange rates changes. Demand for money increases in another country, exchange rates change. And so as a result, it fixes some problems, but then obviously make the whole system a little bit more complex. Now, let me give you a video, and I will attach it so you can watch it, though it's a lengthy one and interesting. But this one is about challenges that Argentina experienced about 20 years ago with respect to its currency exchange rate. So just look for that video in the folder. I'll post it there. Now, let's talk about the exchange rates from a more kind of realistic real-life preview. And I'll give you a specific question or a specific example. In 2008, second part of the year, the US dollar rapidly gained about 30 to 40% of value against all other major currencies. In other words, all other major currencies, from the British pound to the Canadian dollar to euro, lost about 30% almost overnight against the US dollar. So the US dollar became much more expensive. The question is why that happened. Most people believe, those who especially use the terminology weak and strong, believe that when the economy is doing well, the currency is strong. Most people believe that currency goes up in its value when the economy is doing better. And at the same time, they believe, and again wrongfully, that exchange rates go down, like dollar becomes cheaper when the American economy is going down. Well, if you remember anything from 2008, you still remember probably that that was the year when the whole economy crashed. End of summer, early fall, that's when we saw a huge drop in the economy. So that's when we realized that we're in trouble. And then particularly the rest of the year, that's when the trouble, that was the troubling year. Now, how come during that period the US dollar was doing so much better? I mean, yes, it was the global economic crisis eventually, as we learned, but particularly in 2008, that's when we thought that other economies are doing well, but the American economy is in ruins. So why did the US dollar went up so much? And again, if we dropped the terminology of strong and weak and, dropped all the BS about us thinking that the economy's condition predicts the exchange rates, we would actually see the answer very easily. But unfortunately, for some reason, people think that it's all about the economy that affects the exchange rates, and that's when we get into that paradigm trap. So, but anyway, let me explain to you first why in 2008 the US dollar became so much more expensive compared to other currencies. Let me go a little bit back and start from the very beginning to explain how it works. The thing is that money is just one form of wealth. We own things, right? We have some wealth. And we can own things or have wealth in different forms. And the three basic forms of wealth are money, those little pieces of paper that represent our wealth, like for example dollars, right? Lincoln here. We can also have wealth in form of real estate or other forms of property. So for example, your house, your car, your cell phone, your pants, your t-shirt, all these things are also wealth. And even though it's not so easy to sell these forms of wealth, like it's not easy to sell a computer or perhaps a shirt, but technically it's possible. And again, if you have, let's say, 25 houses or you have $10 million, the two may be an equivalent amount of wealth. Just dollars are liquid and easy to move, whereas houses, you would need to sell them first in order to convert them in another form of wealth. But technically it's the same thing. So having $200,000 or one house is basically the same idea. Finally, You can have your wealth in the form of financial instruments, or like for example shares. So you can have shares or a piece of paper that says that you own 10% of XYZ Incorporated. And so again, this piece of paper represents real wealth, which is part of a company that is, an important thing that you might want to have. And if you want to sell it, you can always do it. So you sell your 10% of um, shares, or 10% of the company that you own, and you can convert this form of wealth into, for example, cash. Or you can exchange it for real estate, or you can convert it to cash and then buy real estate with that money. Or you can buy 25 million, I don't know, or 2,500 cell phones, or whatever else you want to buy. And so that would be also a form of wealth. Now, as you understand, all these forms of wealth can be converted in one another. So you can sell real estate for money, or you can sell it for shares, or you can sell it for money and then buy shares, or you can sell your shares and use the money. So either form of wealth is more or less equally good. Just money is most liquid, and then real estate is less liquid. Now, what happened in 2008? Well, first, before what happened before 2008. Before 2008, value of shares markets, share markets, stock markets have been growing like crazy. And most of the people who had some money, they would put that money in shares and hope that the value of the shares will be continue growing over time. The same was happening in the housing market. Price of houses has been increasing roughly at 5 to 10% a year. And again, many people, when they had excess cash, they wouldn't carry it in the wallet as I do today. I have like $50 here. They would try to buy either shares of companies with this money, or they would try to buy real estate with that money, or perhaps buy just car or something else. 2008 comes, and all of a sudden we'll learn that the economy may not be doing so well, particularly the housing market. What happens? People are trying to get rid of the form of wealth that they know will not be worth much soon, because it turns out the price we had for houses was too high. So people are trying to sell their real estate, particularly those investment properties, houses that people owned and had renters there. The same thing with the shares. All of a sudden we realized that the economy is not doing as well as we thought it would be. So we're trying to sell the shares because we're afraid they will be losing value. Now the question is, when we sell houses or when we sell shares, what exactly does it mean? It means that we would like to exchange the form of wealth that is real estate, for example, this thing that you can touch. We want to exchange it for dollars, right? So in other words, we want to swap one form of wealth in another. So all of a sudden what happens is that this form of wealth, the dollars, become in more demand. And these forms of wealth, shares and real estate and other goods, become in less demand. So people want to get rid of their real estate, of their shares, and get more dollars in exchange. And so what happens, demand for one form of wealth increases dramatically. And once that happens, obviously demand pushes price up. And so price of the dollar increases dramatically. Price of the other two forms of wealth decreases. So the reason the US dollar was doing so well in the 2008-2009 period is because everyone was trying to unload other forms of wealth and buy more dollars. So basically exchange their wealth for dollars, sell that and get money back. And so demand for dollars increased. The economy was going down like crazy. But the reason, that was the reason that the value of the dollar increased, because everybody was trying to get rid of all other forms of wealth and get cash instead. And particularly the dollar was doing so well is because the whole crisis started in the United States. And so we're talking here about American houses that need to be sold, American shares that need to be sold. And so since it was going in America, demand for American dollar, because obviously in America you sell houses for American dollars, you sell shares for American dollars. And so obviously this is where the value of the currency went up. And while in other countries everything was still fairly stable, at least for some time people thought the economies were doing well, people there just held on to their money. And so this was the reason why the dollar was going so up. And so the bad state of the economy actually caused an increase in the value of the currency of the country. Hopefully that's understood. So money is just to sum up, is just another product. And so when we want to talk about exchange rates, we should keep in mind that money is just another product, just like your cell phone or water or oil or whatever else, whatever product you're dealing with. And so the exchange rate of your currency goes up when there is more need for that currency, when there is more demand for that currency. when people want to buy that currency for whichever reason, either because they want to sell their shares and get the dollars in exchange, or because the foreigners want to buy the dollars because maybe Americans invented something that everybody wants and they need to buy it with American dollars. So they buy American dollars first, and so the demand for the US dollar increases and its exchange rate increases, or whatever other reason, or the same for the same reason nobody wants, for example, the US dollar anymore. And so the fluctuations in demand cause the changes in exchange rate. And again, as I said, there would be obviously other reasons, like for example, difference in inflation potentially can be a problem. The state of the economy may be a problem, but those things don't change that much. I mean, inflation remains more or less stable in most countries, and more or less at the same level. The economies are not crashing overnight. In most cases, they just grow steadily. And so, but the exchange rates do change a lot even within hours. And so that a lot is the reason or the function of the change in demand for the currency. So we'll get to more details in a few slides. So let's talk about the specific factors that affect exchange rates. In the long run, yes, economic forces such as inflation, economic growth, availability of or demand for natural resources, all those may matter. For example, in Canada, the Canadian dollar has been growing so much and so fast and so predictably over the last over the last 10 years or so, is because demand for oil has been increasing dramatically worldwide. The trouble in the Middle East limited or at least threatened supply of oil from the Middle East. And so Canada emerged as a stable supplier of oil. And as more and more countries buy more and more oil from Canada, obviously they buy it with the Canadian dollar because it's in Canada. And so they create demand for that currency. And as that demand increases, the value, the exchange rate of that currency increases. Plus, the Canadian economy was doing fairly well overall, and more goods all of a sudden were available behind those dollars. So the reserves of oil have been increasing or explored, and new reserves have been discovered. More oil and more other products Canada has been producing. And so since the money actually represents other forms of wealth available in that country, as those other forms of wealth have been growing in size, the kind of amount of wealth represented by each piece of paper called the Canadian dollar has been increasing. And so over a long time, like a decade or at least many years, that was increasing the value of the Canadian dollar. But again, that was a long run. So these things, they don't change overnight. And so the day-to-day fluctuations in exchange rates are basically explained by the supply and demand of currencies or for currencies. And those normally are, as I said, people willing to buy or sell the currency. Like, for example, residents trying to buy foreign currency, and if they buy foreign currency, they would basically pay with their own currency, which means there will be more their own currency on the market. And so, like rumors that maybe the banks in that country will print more money and there will be inflation. So people are trying to get rid of their local currency and maybe exchange it for dollars or maybe euros. So that would lead to a drop in exchange rate of their currency. Maybe professional speculators may, again, create artificial demand for their currency. And again, then the hype, overbuying, and so over demand creates exchange rate increase. Interest rates may affect currency availability big time, and as a result, exchange rates. For example, now in the United States, the exchange rates are at a historic low, close to zero. Right? I mean, the prime interest rates for the ones that the central bank charges to the other banks when the other banks are buying resources from the central bank. So when the exchange rates, interest rates are very low, then money is easily available. You can get lots of money for little pay, so the interest rates are low. That normally lowers the exchange rates of the currency. And so even though the US dollar price went up dramatically in 2008, 2009, this actually has been going down since then fairly steadily. And so one of the reasons is that the exchange rates, the interest rates in the United States have been so low that it is easy to get more dollars. And so since easiness of availability or supply of dollars has been so lavish, exchange rate of the American dollar has been going down. Financial markets, again, price of shares goes up. Everybody wants to buy more shares and hope that the price will continue going up. And so they buy shares, and in other words, they take shares from the market and supply dollars to the market. And so exchange rate of the dollar would go down. And in fact, you would see if you look at the, like for example, Dow Jones or S&P 500, dynamics over time and the dollar dynamics over time, you would see that every time the stock market crashes, the US dollar actually goes up, and every time the stock market goes up, the exchange rate of dollar goes down. All those kinds of things may actually have day-to-day effect in the short run on the exchange rate of a currency. So when we look at again at the dynamics of the US dollar, and here it's against the Canadian dollar, but it's more or less the same dynamics if you look at other currencies. As you see, this is where the crisis happened, 2008, and the US dollar goes up from roughly 1 to 130 almost. So boom, it went up like crazy. And so that basically, that increase of about 30% represented that Americans, as well as foreign residents who own property in America, were trying to sell their property, were trying to sell their houses, their shares, and so they were selling it for the US dollar, and so all of a sudden the value of the US dollar demand, and then consequently the value have increased so much. Over time though, the US economy was kind of doing okay, and so the Canadian dollar was actually losing its value, and the American dollar was slightly kind of going down, and so everything was more or less stable. But yes, that's in the short run, that's when we saw that jump. Now, the next questions are, is strong or weak dollar better for America, for you personally and for your business? And again, I'm using the terminology strong and weak here just because I want to be consistent with how everybody else uses these terms. But really what I'm asking here is overpriced or underpriced dollar is good for America, you personally, in your business? Is dollar that is losing its value or gaining its value, or whose price is increasing or decreasing, is better for you, for America, and for your business? Let me show you a video, and then we'll talk about these questions in a minute.
It may be autumn outside this Brooklyn manufacturing complex, but inside, it's feeling a bit like spring. Demand at Lee Spring, a New York City-based manufacturer since 1918, is bouncing back. Since July, it's seen orders pick up from a wide range of industries, including aerospace, defense, medical, and clean technologies. Helping drive business, rising demand from overseas.
We're seeing a lot of growth into Europe. We're also seeing growth into Mexico, and Canada has been a real highlight of us lately. We're seeing good, strong growth into Canada, and we're seeing growth into the Far East.
During the height of the economic crisis, Lee saw orders plunge more than 20% from normal levels. They're still off about 10%. But Lee hopes to see positive growth next year. One big reason, the weaker dollar, which is helping boost exports.
Sales in certain areas into certain regions where we've been helped by the exchange rate are growing in double digits right now. And that's a big turnaround from the way it was 9 months ago or so when the dollar was moving in the other direction.
Over the past year, the U.S. dollar has dropped 12% against major world currencies. For Lee and other U.S. manufacturers, a weaker dollar means U.S. products are cheaper to buy overseas. Thanks in part to this trend, overall U.S. exports rose at an annual rate of more than 14% over the summer.
This is a torsion spring.
Lee's global marketing director, Helene Herman, says the weaker dollar could persuade overseas buyers to think again about buying American.
A weak dollar may encourage people who might look at buying a product domestically to look at an American-made product, because they're getting more than just the dollar. They're also getting the ingenuity, the engineering expertise, the consistency of materials.
Herman says many small manufacturers she talks to are ready to take even greater advantage of the weak dollar and expand exports, but are being held back by banks reluctant to lend. Despite the challenges, trends may be looking up.
Lee Spring is a good barometer for the economy as a whole because we're so broad-based, and we've certainly seen growth over the last quarter, and we look from what we're reading from our customers that we'll see growth in the next quarter and in 2010.
Business strength benefiting from currency weakness. Maggie Lake, CNN, Brooklyn, New York.
So going back to our question, is strong or weak dollar is good for American economy? Well, based on the video, as you can see, weak, or again what I would call undervalued US dollar is actually very good for the US economy. The US dollar became very expensive or overpriced, or strong as some people say, in 2008 and 2009. But since then it's been its value, price has been declining, and obviously the lower price of the dollar, and again what some people mistakenly call weakness, actually was helping economy a lot. So in the international context, if the value of the dollar or the price of the dollar increases, buying American products becomes difficult because American products are sold for American dollars, and foreigners have to spend more of their money to buy the same amount or number of dollars to buy American products. And so the more expensive the dollar is, the more difficult it is for foreigners to buy American products, which leads to a decrease in exports from the United States, and vice versa. When the US dollar value goes down or price goes down, buying American products becomes cheaper for foreigners, and as it becomes cheaper, foreigners buy American products, and that stimulates exports from the United States and actually makes imports into the United States less interesting. Let me give you a few examples how that may work, and hopefully you will understand a little better. For example, Dell, as well as many other companies, have been known for building their factories in countries where currencies are, and again I'm using quote marks here, weak. Currencies that have been losing values or have been traditionally undervalued. So for example, Malaysia. The currency there has been becoming cheaper and cheaper over time, which means if Dell makes products in Malaysia and then sells them from Malaysia all around the world, all those computers from Dell that you buy, including the one, by the way, that I'm using now to record this video lecture, makes a lot of sense for Dell, because when they sign a contract with a Malaysian employee, let's say they promise him to pay $1,000 a year or $100 a year, whatever the price is. Let's use $100 just as a nice round number. With that $100 a year, they can buy, let's say, 100 local dollars in Malaysia. Over time, as the Malaysian dollar becomes cheaper compared to the American dollars, Dell can buy the same number of local dollars with a smaller number of American dollars. And even though over time, because of the inflation exchange rate, the wages probably will be growing a little bit, but they will not be growing as fast as the depreciation of the currency. And so every time Dell now has to pay salaries in Malaysia, or pay for maintenance of the buildings, or pay taxes, they effectively save money, and that saving is equivalent to the price or the exchange rate or the percent to which the exchange rate dropped compared to the US dollar. At the same time, if Malaysian dollar started becoming more expensive, making stuff in Malaysia would become more expensive because effectively real wages would increase, as well as taxes and maintenance or whatever else, other operation expenses would increase. And at that stage, exporting from Malaysia wouldn't make much sense. So as American dollar has been becoming cheaper, buying stuff from the US, making stuff in the US, and buying it from other countries, buying from the United States into other countries became more valuable. So it makes just perfect economic sense. And so weaker currency or undervalued currency is actually a very good thing for the economy. In fact, if you've been following all that conflict with China, China has been accused lately of manipulating its currency. By manipulating, what that meant was by artificially keeping Chinese currency, yuan, undervalued, lower than it should be. And by doing so, keeping Chinese products more accessible or cheaper to foreigners. And by doing so, stimulating production in China. We'll talk in a few minutes about how that can be done by the government. But for now, again, the point is that by keeping your currency, again, I don't want to use the term weak, undervalued, cheaper, you can actually stimulate the economy of your country by, encouraging exports and limiting imports, or making exports more economically feasible and imports into the country less economically feasible. Now, if you don't believe me that weak currency actually means better economy or stimulates the economy, here are some quotes from April 29, 2009. That's when the US dollar was sharply up, very expensive. So it was worth, Canadian dollar became much more expensive than the US dollar, or the US dollar lost about 30% compared to the Canadian dollar over a few months period. So as you read these quotes, you will see that yes, US exports collapsed 30%, the biggest decline since 1969 in response to the US dollar increase. So Americans had a very, very hard time exporting its products when the US dollar was expensive. The declining exports knocked off a record 4 percentage points from GDP. So all those problems obviously again were caused at least to some extent by the expensive dollar, or what many people would call strong dollar. And so we have a whole bunch of quotes here in case you want to read them. Now, if weak dollar, or again undervalued currency, is so stimulating for the economy, why not keep it weak? Why only China keeps its currency weak? Why America doesn't do it? Many people mistakenly think because Americans are so ethical and they believe that it's not ethical to keep your currency weak. No, absolutely not. Obviously, it's economy, and as long as it's legal, there is really ethics is not really that relevant. The reason is that keeping currency weak or undervalued is very expensive. Not every country can do it. If it was an easy solution, if America could simply keep the dollar cheap, America would do it. In fact, that would be very nice and wise policy. The problem is that it's a very difficult, very expensive proposition, and only a few countries, like including China, could do that. There are several ways a government can keep a currency weak or undervalued. The simplest method would be to print more money, but obviously printing more money would cause what? Inflation. Inflation has a very bad, very detrimental effect on the economy. And so by printing more dollars, even though that would stimulate exports and stimulate demand for American products from overseas, it would cause so many more problems that it's obviously not worth playing. So what are other ways then to keep the currency undervalued without causing the inflation? And so this is what we're going to talk about. Well, as we discussed before, the exchange rate of the currency depends on the demand for the currency. Obviously, again, things like inflation long-term may matter, but again, if you think about it, inflation, the reason it causes decrease in the currency exchange rate of the currency is because inflation effectively provides more dollars, more printed, and so dollars become cheaper and so less valuable. What can be done though is, well, if you want to keep your dollar or your currency overpriced, you create demand for it. If you want to keep your currency undervalued, you create supply of it. So you try to flood market with your currency. Now, let's talk about how you can flood the market with a currency. Well, obviously, you can print the dollar, but we're now established that it would be a bad idea. Another thing is you can sell your dollars. By selling, it means that you would have to buy something with dollars, right? So again, selling and buying, what that is exchange. So what it means that you would need to buy something from the market by dumping dollars into the market. But buying something, that's not so easy. I mean, to buy something, you first have to have dollars. Second, whatever you buy, what do you do with that? So for example, what China does, it buys huge reserves of foreign currencies. China buys lots of dollars, lots of euros, and by buying, I mean dumping their own currency into the market and keeping foreign currency reserves. Now, this is very expensive because China has trillions of dollars, US dollars and euros in other currencies. This is a huge amount of money pretty much frozen. I mean, not everyone has the resources to do that. The United States, having huge debt, I mean, just doesn't have the resources. I mean, yes, it would be nice to dump lots of dollars and instead buy foreign currencies, but we just don't have the resources. Second, even if we did, is that such a good idea? I mean, in the long run, what China is doing now is stimulating Chinese economy. But then one day, if let's say, for example, the US government decided to print American dollars, or if the US government decided to default on its debt, and the US dollar lost its value, China would be just sitting with bags and bags and more like trains and trains of American dollars that are not worth much. And so what that would mean is that China has been giving us all those products and eventually will not get anything back because the dollars that they got for the products that they gave us may be worth less. So in the long run, it's actually not such a good proposition. Furthermore, now China has accumulated huge resource of foreign currencies, but eventually that money has to be spent, and when that time comes, China effectively will be stimulating demand for American and European products. And again, increasing your foreign currency reserves indefinitely is not possible because first, it's very expensive, and second, why would you want to do it? I mean, eventually, what are you going to burn that currency? And that's wealth. I mean, you don't do it. And so at this time, the way China has been stimulating its economy is by basically, paying more for our products not for our products, but for their products and giving them to us more or less for free. Now, is that a wise policy or not? Hard to say. On the one hand, China was, at level zero just a few years ago, while America was here. As China is trying to catch up with America, it needs to develop its production capacity, ability to build products. And the only way China can do it is by stimulating its economy, basically by making its products more attractive to foreigners. And as China makes those products and essentially gives them to us for free because we pay to China, but China is not using the money that we paid. So it's almost like we write the checks, but China never cashes them, right? So as China does it, it stimulates production in its own country and they grow that expertise. So eventually, several years from now, or maybe many years from now, when China has finally decided or will decide to dump the American dollars and European currencies, euros, and by doing so stimulate demand for our products, at that time, I believe the hope is that Chinese manufacturers will be so strong and so advanced that they will be able to compete with us. And at that time, people would be buying our products as well as their products because theirs will be comparatively good and high quality and comparatively cheap. But again, America doesn't do it because first, doesn't keep the US dollar cheap because first, it's very expensive. And second, it actually may be a problem in the long run, especially if that money eventually turns into nothing because China holds our dollars. And if we do something to the dollar, print more of them, or devalue them in some way, or default on our debt, or who knows what can go in the United States, revolution, war, who knows? China will be left with nothing. It would mean that all these decades China has been shipping products to us for free and eventually get nothing in exchange. If China decides to get something in exchange, China would have to stimulate demand for our products, and so then we will be on the horse. China, of course, can basically buy our property, for example, use those dollars to buy our land and natural resources and houses. But again, in a sense, that would be stimulating the economy. So what China is doing now is not sustainable. It will have to end one day. And when it will end, there is a very good chance China will not be in a very good position. So it's a risky proposition, probably not such a bad idea if that's a short-term policy to stimulate your economy to get it up to speed. But in the long run, not such a good idea. Now, here is your final first question, or one of the questions today. And the correct answer, obviously, think about Dell, is it improves its profits, right? So there is nothing illegal about it. There is really nothing unethical about it. I mean, unless they intentionally cause the change in the exchange rate. But I mean, if that's what's happening and they just use that as an economic opportunity, nothing wrong with that. Definitely not bankrupt. I mean, if anything, it increases its chances of survival, the company. But it does improve its profits. Now, how do we forecast exchange rates? Exchange rates do change a lot, and I wish I knew them in advance. If I did, I would be very rich. But how do you forecast? There are two main approaches to forecasting exchange rates. One is what we call fundamental analysis. This is basically looking at the state of the economy, at the inflation, at other things that are important to the economy. But this approach works very well only in the long run. Or you use technical analysis. In technical analysis, if you have taken stats courses yet, and if you know what multiple regression is, that's basically what they do. And it's much more sophisticated than that, but that's the main idea. You plug all the variables into the model, and you basically see what the result is. And so, as you probably understand by now, in many cases, rumors, weather, all kinds of little things may affect exchange rates fluctuations big time. Something blows up, and for example, the Middle East, everybody gets concerned about the supply of oil from the Middle East. Canadian dollar goes up within 2 minutes. The reason for that is not because really Canadian economy is doing better or worse for that same matter, just because there is an expectation that the Canadian oil will become more valuable because supply of oil from the Middle East may run out. And so as a result, there would be need for Canadian dollars to buy Canadian oil. And again, normally next day the price of Canadian dollar goes down because everyone realizes that explosion in the Middle East was really not that big and not that important. But again, that may create fluctuations in exchange rates. And so technical analysis is not really looking at the relationships, in the economic sense, but more just trying to find factors that may predict even speculative forces as well as real economic forces, or in other words, demand and supply for currencies. And so this is more sophisticated from the perspective of, more technically sophisticated, but at the same time sometimes almost speculative and almost, in a sense gambling. But technical analysis, that's what it does. And, not to say that one is better than the other, just fundamental analysis works better for the long term, whereas technical analysis works better for the short term predictions. Now, obviously, with exchange rates, as everything else, speculative forces are at play here. When a currency is increasing in value, everyone is trying to cash on it, trying to earn some money on it, just like with any other products. So people are trying to buy it in hope that the value will continue to rise. And then eventually people realize that the price they're paying now is too high, so we're basically dealing with bubble, and then people try to sell. And so what happens is usually we'll overbuy when the price is increasing, we oversell when the price is decreasing. And so while the fundamentals are developing more or less steady, slow increase or slow decrease, the actual prices often go too high and then too low, and so speculative forces are at work here, and we definitely see that with currencies, just like any other types of commodity or products. Now let's talk about something else. Let's talk about prices. Very interesting topic. And the question is, why identical items have different prices in different locations? And by prices, I don't mean the number, the actual price on the price tag. I mean the real price, the real value adjusted for the exchange rate. So why do they change from location to location? Why, for example, a cell phone like this may cost more in one country and less in another country, or more in one region of the world and less in another region? And so another question would be, there is what we call the law of one price. Technically, if trade was free and the market was free, we should, in theory, end up with the same price in every location. If the price was higher somewhere, then what would happen is we would just sell products there. You would not sell the product where it's cheaper, you would sell the product where it's lower. And that kind of communicating vessel type of law would make the prices equal everywhere. Even though it may be profitable to sell the product for less here than there, it just wouldn't make sense for you to sell the product here. You would just sell it everywhere, only where the price is more expensive, which would eventually, that supply lead to lowering price there, decrease in supply here would increase price here, and so technically the price should be the same everywhere on identical products, but obviously that's not the case. And so the question is, why do we see that? Why do prices differ from location to location for identical products? Why arbitrage opportunities arise? Why sometimes you can buy the same product there for less and resell it here for more? Why? In other words, or I'll give you a hint, why buying a product in one country and selling it in another for profit may be profitable? So tell me that. Well, before I answer that question for you, and while you're thinking about it, let me tell you a little story here. There is this, what they call a Big Mac index. There was this guy at Harvard a long time ago who thought that it would be interesting to compare the price of McDonald's Big Mac in different locations. And as they started comparing the price of McDonald's burger in different locations, the team of scholars from Harvard noticed that the price fluctuated a lot from location to location. Now, with other products, like for example cell phones, we can have all kinds of reasons. Like for example, if it's made, this is LG, so if it's made in South Korea or maybe in China, we would imagine that the price there should be lower than the price in the United States. At the very least, the price here should be the price of making the product there plus the transportation cost, right? But Big Mac is a beautiful product from many perspectives. It's a harmful product, we know that, but it's a beautiful product from the economic sense, or in the economic sense. The beauty of Big Mac is that first, it's sold in pretty much every single country on the planet. Like this cell phone, it's probably sold only in the United States, maybe in Europe, maybe in some countries in Asia, but nowhere else. And it's even questionable if it's sold all around North America and other regions. So, it's a beautiful product from the economic sense because first, it's sold in pretty much every single country. Second, it's usually made out of local components. Not like that beef or that salad or that flour for the bread is imported from the United States. No, in most countries, the components, ingredients are local. If not local, then from somewhere nearby. Third, it's a very standardized product in terms of, how it's served, what, image it has, what value it has. So Big Mac is a Big Mac. And yes, there was a time once in Russia, in like in the 80s, when Big Mac was pursued as a luxury meal, and people would actually line up to get that product on the Red Square in Moscow, like 2 hours before they can actually buy it. And so, but that was lasted like for a few months. I mean, yes, there have been many myths and stories about it in the United States, but soon enough, Big Mac or McDonald's just became what McDonald's is here, like a fast food cheap restaurant, right? So the image-wise, it's pretty much the same product everywhere. So nobody thinks that it's a luxury. Nobody thinks that it's really junk anywhere. So I mean, it's just McDonald's. So very, very convenient to compare the price of this product in different countries because of that such standard, ingredients, image, marketing, quality, look, everything is the same. And so as those scholars from Harvard were comparing the price of the product in different countries, they found that the price actually varied drastically in different locations. McDonald's was selling Big Mac much, much more expensively, for example, in Switzerland than it did in China. In fact, the real price in Switzerland of a Big Mac is roughly $5. In the United States, it's roughly $3, right? In China, it was only about $1.30. So the difference was like 1 to 4. The question becomes why? Why? And so that's the question I have for you, right? So if the Big Mac is the new gold standard, it's identical in pretty much all countries. It's made virtually everywhere out of local components, so transportation cost is not an issue. And it's sold by the same company with the same image. How come it's different? Well, there are many different reasons. One, it's still availability, right? If you have McDonald's on every corner in one country, supply is greater, and if there are fewer McDonald's restaurants in another country, supply is limited, so it's a demand-supply issue. Second, availability of the ingredients. Yes, ingredients are local, but in the United States, beef, flour, lettuce, I mean, it's readily available. Climate is suitable to grow those things. You go to Japan, not so easy. I mean, yes, you have some agriculture there, but not that much. You go to some European countries that are densely populated, not so easy, or Singapore. So obviously, again, price of those ingredients may be different, which dictates differences in price. Now, real wages. The guy who's serving you the McDonald's Big Mac in the United States probably makes what, like $10 an hour, maybe more. Not the same. A guy in the same position in China probably makes $1 an hour. All of a sudden, you can save money there. Taxes, big deal, like sales tax. I mean, it differs a lot from state to state. In Alberta, my last place of residence, Canada, it was only 4%. Here, it's almost 8%. Right there, you have 4% difference in price. Now, cost of land, cost of facilities. I mean, you can imagine that a McDonald's restaurant, the rent for that space in Greensboro is probably 1/10 of what it is in Tokyo or in Manhattan. And again, you have to factor that into the price because whatever you pay in Tokyo for your building, for your place where you have the restaurant, it's just more expensive, and you got to make up those losses or for that extra cost in the price of your product. And then everything else, like from bribes to other unofficial costs of risks that other countries may incur, efficiency of retailers, efficiency of logistics, supply chain companies, all that stuff matters. Then obviously size of retailers, economies of scale matters. If you only have one restaurant in, for example, Ghana, you can imagine that, economies of scale are not there. Making 1 million burgers and then shipping them around the country is much cheaper per burger than making 10 of those. And then obviously import tariffs may matter. Again, transportation, even though for Big Mac it's not such a big deal, but for other products it may be. And so you import your product, you may be paying 10, 20, 30% in import taxes, and that definitely may matter as to how much the product's price will be in that country. Technology, transportation cost, all those things are very important. In the United States, everything is very efficient. I mean, computer programs make logistics, make accounting very simple. In some countries, it may still be done, by hand on paper, and so that creates more cost to operate the business. And again, for Big Mac, with McDonald's using pretty much standardized software everywhere, I suppose it's not a factor, but for other products, it may be. And then obviously competition as well as different needs. I mean, you're trying to sell a fancy gourmet meal in, for example, Manhattan, you'll have lots of rich lawyers and bankers who would be willing to buy that product. Try selling that same stuff here on UNCG campus. How many people can afford that kind of stuff? So demand would be much lower, and the only way to sell that product here would be to charge less. And that's why you can get, restaurants with entry meal prices of about $100 in Manhattan, and you hardly ever see anything more than $15 to $20 here in Greensboro. Again, demand-supply factor. So all those things not only determine prices, but then again, consequently may also determine exchange rates, as well as may determine why you have to pay more for something somewhere else than you pay here, or less for that same reason. Anyway, here is a question about Big Mac. Let's see if you can answer why or what Big Mac index is. And yes, it is B. It is a method, in a sense, for estimating exchange rates and comparative cost of living in different countries. The other answers, if you want to read them, are obviously wrong. Now, let's talk also about purchasing power parity. How should I put it? $100 is $100, right? Regardless of exchange rates, it is $100. Or if, let's see how much I have here. Let's see if I take $5 here, $5 is $5 in the United States, $5 is $5 in Ukraine, in Canada, in Tokyo, in Colombia, and whatever other country you go to. It's the same value. And if you want to buy, for example, Deutsche Marks or whatever else with this, well, I guess euros today, with this piece of paper, the exchange rate would be more or less the same everywhere. The thing is, though, that the amount of goods or wealth you can buy with this piece of paper is different in different countries. $5 will not buy you much in the United States, but it can buy you a lot in China. You can probably live in China on $5 a day, at least as far as buying your food. But here in the United States, you can get what? An ice cream maybe in a restaurant, or maybe, I don't know, a hot dog or something like that. The question is, why do the same $1 or $100 buy more in some locations than in others? And so that brings us to the concept of purchasing power parity. And so the way I want to talk about is this. Purchasing power parity is essentially a comparative worth of the same amount of money in terms of how much it can buy in a different location. And as you can imagine, cost of living, transportation cost, product availability, all those things that we discussed with respect to Big Mac index, all these things here differ from location to location. And as a result, the same number of dollars, currency, can buy more in one location and less in another location. The reason, or the times when we think about purchasing power parity, is when we think about real wealth of people. Yes, for example, people in some countries make more money than Americans make, or maybe less money than Americans make. Like, for example, wages or GDP per capita is higher in Switzerland, and it is lower in, for example, Czech Republic, as we discussed in one of the lectures. But what's important is that the same number of dollars can buy much more in the Czech Republic and much less in Switzerland compared to what it can buy in the United States. And so even though people can be making more money, may have higher wages or lower wages in some countries, what they really can buy with their wage may be substantially different compared to what Americans could buy in the United States with the same wage. So $1,000 in the United States is not really that much money per month. It's probably not even enough to pay your rent. Whereas if you go with that same amount of money to China or Czech Republic, you can actually live very comfortably for the whole month. You can rent a house, you can buy your food and stuff like that. And so the same number of dollars may be a very different amount of wealth in different locations. And so when we talk about GDP, or when we talk about real wages, or when we talk about other indicators of economic development, we usually, especially when we talk about financial indicators, we usually try to adjust them for purchasing power parity, so that when we compare those numbers, we could actually compare not only the pieces of paper, $5 here and $5 there, but we could actually compare what this piece of paper can buy in different locations. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So when you will be, for example, well, you will not be doing your take-home assignment number 1 again, but if you were, I would say that you should be looking more at the GDP per capita adjusted at purchasing power parity, or income level at purchasing power parity, so that you can not only say that this guy gets X number of dollars, but so you could say that this guy gets more wealth than this guy. Because once you adjust for purchasing power parity, you can actually see that the dollars, the number of dollars, may not be that meaningful after all. Now, inflation versus weak currency. Again, we did talk about inflation as not really a factor in exchange rates, and this is very true. As I said, inflation rate has been remarkably consistent in just about every developed country. Canada, the United States, Germany, France, just about any developed country, the inflation rate has been what, about 2-3% a year, pretty much over the last century. Yes, there were years when it was a little higher. The last couple of years in the United States, the inflation was more like 1%, maybe even less than that, 0.5%. But generally, it's more or less within that corridor, as well as if it's lower, it's lower everywhere. Inflation has been more or less around 1% in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, and other developed countries. And vice versa, when it's higher in the United States, it tends to be higher in other countries. The same thing, developing countries tend to have somewhat higher inflation, but again, consistently higher in different countries. So obviously, inflation is not fluctuating or differs that much from a country to country, and so it's not really explaining the differences in exchange rates. They do fluctuate a lot, but there are sometimes exceptions or sometimes times when inflation is much higher. And as I said, I personally experienced inflation of about 10,000% a year in the early 90s and mid 90s in Ukraine. At that time, I just came from Germany. Actually, it was before I went to Germany, so it must have been like late 80s and early 90s. Inflation was huge. It was like thousands of percent every year. And so wages, as I said, salaries were paid twice a day, because by the end of the day, your money was worth nothing. You get 1 million of your local dollars, and by the end of the day, you can't even buy a loaf of bread with that. So that was a terrible time. And so had that currency been freely traded at that time, you would obviously see a huge drop in the exchange rate from day to day. And there was actually a time when we all were billionaires, like when wages and everything was in billions of local dollars. So obviously when you have something like that, in those cases, inflation would be a factor and would determine exchange rates. Now, this is pretty much a question from your take-home assignment, so you might want to listen carefully here. The fiscal policy. This is what the real cause of exchange rates is. The fiscal policy. In other words, what a government can do to keep the rate of its currency stable, or when needed, make it more expensive or less expensive. What a government can do to weaken or to strengthen local currency. And the simple answer would be, if you want to weaken your local currency, you have to make other forms of wealth more attractive and easily attainable, so that the people try to have their wealth in something else: real estate, shares, other forms of financial instruments, whatever else people may want to transfer their dollars into. On the other hand, if you want to strengthen your currency, you might want to make other forms of wealth less interesting and make dollars more interesting. So in other words, make dollars more desired. So, or in simple terms, you might want to lower demand for dollars or increase demand for dollars, or lower supply of dollars and increase demand of dollars. Now the question becomes, all right, so if to weaken your currency, you have to increase supply of dollars and make dollars easier attainable, thereby reducing demand for dollars. What can you do? And on the other hand, if you want to strengthen your dollar, you have to increase demand for your dollars. You have to make them less available, limit supply of dollars. The question is, what can you do as a government? Those are very important questions. Don't take them lightly. Now, I recommend that you pause here and give it 5 minutes of thought. Let's see if you can answer those questions. Those are very interesting questions, by the way, and again, they're in your take-home assignment. Now, if you're lazy and don't want to think, don't pause. I'll give you the answers. Well, to weaken the local currency, you have to increase supply of that local currency. You have to make it easier available, right? What you can do is lower interest rates, for example. You lower the central bank's interest rates, the prime rate. All of a sudden, banks are willing to lend the money, the dollars, for less. And the demand, as the supply of dollars increases, the price of dollar decreases. And I guess the opposite would be true. If you would like to make your currency more expensive, you increase the interest rate, and so that makes supply of your currency limited, and as a result, the price goes up. The problem is the United States is trying to lower the price of dollars so that the demand for American products is higher and the balance of trade is restored. But the problem is that the current prime rate, the interest rate set by the central bank is close to zero. So you can just, you can't lower it any further. Unless you start paying banks to borrow money from you. But, obviously that would not be easy to do. Another thing you can do is lower taxes. By lowering taxes, you essentially leave more of these pieces of paper in the pockets of the people, or in other words, you increase supply of these pieces of paper because people have more of them left in their pocket. You can also print more money, but as we said, I mean, that will surely increase the supply of dollars, but it will not be a good idea because it will automatically lead to inflation, and so the negative consequences of that are just much bigger. Second thing, what you can do is you can sell government securities cheaper, right? So you can basically flood the market with financial instruments. Or you can buy foreign currencies and sell reserves of domestic currency. So in other words, you can buy more euros and you can buy more Chinese yuans and whatever else with these pieces of paper. And as you do so, all of a sudden there are more dollars flooding the market, and so they become less valuable. Now, to strengthen the currency, you just do the opposite. You increase interest rates, you increase taxes. That limits the supply of dollars because it makes dollars harder to attain. Less of the dollars are left or available for the people, and so obviously that increases the exchange rate of the currency. You can buy government securities, and you can sell reserves of foreign currencies as well as buy domestic currency. Just the opposite of what we discussed before that. Now, this is embarrassing, but I just realized that my buy government securities and sell government securities, I had them in the wrong places. So since government securities is another form of wealth, obviously if you want to weaken the currency, you buy government securities, right? So you sell dollars and you buy government securities. And on the other hand, if you want to strengthen your currency, you sell government securities cheaper. And so that creates demand for dollars because you're dumping one form of wealth and you collect another form of wealth. And so supply of dollars decreases, and as a result, price of dollar increases. But then again, the government can't really buy many more government securities, even though it's been trying to buy them, as you know. I mean, you need money to do that, and so that financial easing, what we call, is not so easy to do because it's just costly. Now, it's extremely important to remember, though, that manipulating currency is not only expensive, but it may be risky in the long run. So it may sound like a good idea, or China manipulates its currency, or in the 80s and the 90s, we've accused Japan of manipulating and keeping its currency cheap to promote exports from Japan, and everyone here was concerned about that. Oh, see, we're buying more Japanese cars, or we're buying more Japanese electronics. They're manipulating their currency. We're going to be doomed. We got to do something about that. And so at that time, presidents of the United States, every time they meet with the Japanese prime ministers, they would say, no, 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 you shouldn't be doing that. And today, obviously, I mean, just go anywhere. Everybody talks about China being so evil and, manipulating its currency. And so President Obama, every time he meets with China, he says, no, you shouldn't be doing that. And then Donald Trump had a huge, basically that's what his campaign was built upon when he was still trying to run for the presidential nomination. But the thing is that in the long run, it may actually not work out that well. Like, we know where Japan is today. I mean, in the 80s, it looked like it would be #1 country in the world. But then eventually we know that that approach led to all kinds of problems. China, we'll see how it goes. But my forecast is, if they continue keeping their local currency cheap the way they do it now by accumulating huge reserves of foreign currencies and gold, my forecast is eventually it's not going to work and may actually leave China in a very disadvantaged position. So just keep that in mind when you're the director of the central bank of the United States or whatever country you will be living in. At that time, just think twice before you try to fight the market and try to manipulate the rates set by the market. Now here's a question. $1 Canadian is worth 97 US cents. In other words, American dollar is more expensive. What does it mean? That's a test if you've been listening to me in the first 10 minutes of this lecture. Remember I told that most students couldn't get those questions right? Well, let's see if you now can. And the correct answer is, well, obviously none of the above can be concluded based on the information provided. The exchange rate tells you nothing. I mean, it tells you something, but definitely nothing about the strength of the economy. It definitely tells you anything about the strength of the currency, because you would have to look at the dynamics for that. It just tells you that, $1 Canadian is worth so many American dollars today, but that's about it. It doesn't tell you much. Now, strong currency, is it curse or cure? As it was said, strong currency or overvalued currency or overpriced currency, which would be a better term, I wouldn't call it good or bad. I can just tell you what it would lead to. We know that it may hurt domestic producers because if the dollar is expensive, they have a hard time selling their products outside the United States, including in the United States as well. And so obviously it's not stimulating production. At the same time, we know that it helps imports. So if the US dollar is strong, it becomes easier to buy products from China, from Germany, from Japan, from all those countries. Is it good or bad? Well, it obviously hurts domestic producer, but many American companies make products using components from overseas. Like in this cell phone, wherever it was made, but if it was made in the United States, many components would be from China, from Japan, from Korea. And if so, then American companies making this product would have an easier time buying those components. And so that may actually be a positive thing. So sometimes imports are needed. Then also at the same time, imports of energy and natural resources become easier. And again, if you think you need those, and I'm telling you you do, then yes, strong dollar kind of helps in a sense. And then finally, strong dollar may actually strengthen businesses in the long run. If you believe that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, then strong dollar definitely makes your life as a businessman, as a company, as a manufacturer tougher. And by making your life tougher, it forces you to be more innovative, it forces you to be more efficient, and in the long run, it actually may help you. Just like, when you raise your kid, the more you train them, the more you make them make homework, makes their childhood miserable, but then in the long run, it actually makes their life better. Finally, this is what you need to know on the exam, and as I've said many times, I promise you there will be nothing else on the exam other than these things, but this is a big but. You need to know these things fairly well. So, for example, when we talk about factors affecting exchange rates, I say here inflation, employment, interest rates, all those things. Well, you need to know the actual mechanism, right? So you just don't memorize those terms. But anyway, this is what you need to know in the exam, and